Welcome, bienvenue. My name is Renee Ketchum, and I curate the cultural offerings of the AFUSA network. I'm thrilled to be here today with Melissa Sora, our National Programming Administrator, to welcome Aleksandra Crapanzano, who will be speaking to Alexander Lobrano about her new cookbook, GÂTEAU, The Surprising Simplicity of French Cakes. AFUSA is the largest Alliance Française network in the world, helping 25,000 learners of French each year learn French, live French, and love French with the Alliance Française. Please take a look at www.afusa.org. We have some wonderful programs coming up. So you can see here, but go to the website so we don't take any time away from this wonderful program. Logistics, please stay on mute during the presentation and stay on with you. We will have a Q&A, but please make sure that all of your questions go in the chat. And if you have any technical issues, just sign back in after signing out for a couple of minutes and using the original Zoom link. This event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and we will have a total runtime of 1 hour. So again, welcome, Aleksandra Crapanzano. Aleksandra is a Wall Street food columnist and screenwriter. She wrote for the New York Times Magazine and Gourmet, for which she received the MFK Fisher Award for Distinguished Writing from the James Beard Foundation. She is also the author of the London Cookbook and Eat, Cook, LA. Alexander Lobrano divides his time between Paris and an old stone house near Uzès in the south of France. Alexander has written about food and travel for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, the Financial Times, Bon Appetit, Food, Wine, Saveur, Travel and Leisure, Condé Nast Traveler, and more. His latest book, My Place at the Table, A Recipe for a Delicious Life in Paris, was published by Harvest Books in June 2021. So I welcome you all to this wonderful conversation with Aleksandra and Alex.
It's a huge pleasure to be here. And it also gave me the opportunity to spend a lot of time with Aleksandra's wonderful, wonderful book. GâTEAU, for me, as an American who's lived in France for such a long time, it's beautifully written as a book. I mean, it's a book you actually enjoy putting in your lap and reading, because there's beautiful storytelling, and Aleksandra is a wonderful, wonderful writer. But it's also a book that I call, in terms of cookbooks, I cook a lot, even though I'm well known for restaurant reviews. Some cookbooks live in my office, some live in my library, and some live filthy lives in the kitchen, which means that I use them all the time. And Aleksandra's book, ever since I received it, has been spattered and stained and abused in kitchens in the United States and in France, and because it's a book where you immediately find yourself thinking, that's what I'll make for dessert tonight. And so I'm very curious to know from her what the origins of the book, what made her decide to do this wonderful and hugely useful book now. Where did the idea come from, and how did you go about doing it? Because it was an enormous amount of work.
It was. And I just want to say thank you to the Alliance, which is a beloved institution to me, and a very particular thank you to Alec. I am a massive fan and deeply honored. And My Place at the Table, which everybody must read, is one of the most beautifully written memoirs I have read in a very, very long time. And Hungry for Paris lives on all of my shelves. So thank you for being here. This was a pandemic book, which is something I sort of hate to say because everybody has their pandemic project at this point. But I was living in Connecticut. I moved up to Connecticut with my family in March of 2020 to a very small house we have, and I was somewhat driven to distraction by the idea that I could not get to Paris. That the border was closed, that travel was impossible. And it really brought out to me the fact that I spent so many years in France, and I consider it very, very much a second home, but I am not a French citizen. And I longed for it. And I think this book was in so many ways my attempt at writing my way home. It was very much about going back to my childhood, living the language in my head tasting it, baking it, dreaming of it, imagining it, all of those things really, really played into the desire to write this book. And, and then of course I thought, well, it's going to be a short pandemic. So if I do a book, it'll be, 60 pages and one of those little books that is an impulse buy at the top of Barnes and Noble at the checkout counter. And I'll bake one cake a day, perfect one cake a day. And then the pandemic kind of grew and grew and grew, as we know, heartbreakingly. And I kept baking. And at a certain point at, cake 125 on day 125, I realized, there isn't a book on this subject. And then it became an entirely different book for me. Then it really did become a mission, because as I was, there's so many books on French pastry. There's so many books on French desserts and elaborate, intricate ones or simple ones, but there is not a book on the very simple cakes that the French will bake at home. And, and it, particularly during the pandemic, it felt like such an accessible subject in a way that you can open up your pantry and make something in a very little amount of time that was really fantastic. So that was the origin of it. And then, as you thankfully pointed out, it was heavily researched. It's almost 400 pages. I didn't want it to read as if it was heavily researched, but it is. But the research was fun too.
There's an enormous and brilliant precision to it, Alexandra, and it's precise without being intimidating, which I say is a compliment. I also love, you mentioned French pâtisserie, and which has become sort of, those who've been in France recently, French pâtisserie has become sort of a new frontier on luxury good marketing. I mean, brand name pâtissier like Pierre Hermé, like Cédric Grolet. There are lots of them now. They are becoming international gastronomic superstars, which is interesting and charming to some degree, I suppose. But the French food, as an American who's lived in France for 35 years, that I like best is what I call my neighbor's cooking, and it's dishes, recipes like the ones that you recount and manage to make so accessible in your book, that still I think come as a surprise to Americans, because I think that there's this persistent idea that French cooking is too time consuming, too complicated, too fussy, too expensive, too much, when the reality of it is, and I can't believe if Julia Child was sitting next to me, I think she'd horn in and agree with us. It's simplicity incarnate a lot of the time. The deliciousness derives from the quality of really great ingredients, and that's something that you're very precise about in the book. You explain it so carefully, and I wanted to ask you about that too, because the difference between French flour and French dairy goods and French everything else, and what one can find in America. Is there a huge difference? Were you conscious of that as you codified the recipes and tested them?
I was, and I'm going to kind of go backwards in what you said. I'll start with the last thing. The flour, I absolutely tested everything with King Arthur flour in America and Land O'Lakes butter, although I also used French butter and specified that when I wanted to. The difference in flour is interesting. It is French flour. There's so many French flours, right? When you go into, a good market in France, and there won't be just, cake flour and bread flour. There will be, 15 flours. But the essential one that almost everybody has in Paris in their pantry skews a little bit closer to cake flour. So I often do use that. But I wanted, I definitely wanted this to be, wanted it to be a book that you could use everywhere in a way, which is also why I put grams in there. But going back to what I love that you said about practicality and the simplicity of it is, to me, that was also really the heart of this book, which is, I think the perception that you say is so accurate, that people do believe that French food is too much, too complicated, that it's, a thing from the past and completely unapproachable. And the reality that we know is home cooking is in fact very simple. And what really strikes me about that is that I think, when you decide that you're going to eat well every day, which I think is a very French feeling, then you have to be somewhat practical, and you have to be somewhat frugal, and you're not in that kind of binge mentality. And you're also not in that sense of, oh my goodness, I've got people coming over, I'm going to take out this new chef book and try a recipe that's going to take me 3 days that I've never made before, and is going to make me incredibly nervous when everybody arrives and I'm still in the kitchen and nobody's eating until 11. So to what I really, as I've kind of grown up, as somebody who cooks and is a professional, is that my cooking has become so much more simple as I have grown in confidence as well. And, it is very much about letting those ingredients shine. And I think it is also very much that the French they treat their desserts in the same way that they treat their savory food, in that everything is meant to be balanced and nuanced. So that when you take a bite of one of these cakes, you're not getting that rush of sugar. You really are tasting whatever the cake is made of, whether it's, strawberries or hazelnuts or chocolate or orange, whatever it is. And so I think there's that wonderful mix of just showcasing ingredients and, learning the simplicity of food that you can make every day, so that you actually do make it every day and you live well, and that you can cook casually but incredibly well. And then frugality, which I think is.
I think also the simplicity is something that I really love, because when you look at, when I go back to America and wander down a baking aisle and look at all of those cake mixes, I think to myself, why would anyone do that? It does not, if I could give everyone a copy of your wonderful book, which is actually probably one of the best Christmas presents or holiday presents anybody could get this year, I would say, with this book, cake mixes be gone, because no, you don't want or need that, because cake mixes by definition are filled with all sorts of things that aren't necessary if you're using quality ingredients. Those bewildering labels on American cake mixes. You're using quality produce. And I think also you put your finger on another fascinating cultural trope, which is there is the French like sugar less than I think we do in North America. I think that American home baking traditions came from different immigrant streams. And the French, the French never really got a look in. So much was dominated by the English and British baking traditions, British and German baking traditions in the United States. This wonderful realm of light, fresh, wholesome, delicious, subtle cakes, both, and we'll get to the savory ones later, but that you bring to us are actually truly things that you could, make within a half an hour from pantry ingredients, and bring huge delight to people at the table. And even also when the wonderful thing you're talking about, how to use different flavored liqueurs to bring flavor, or fresh fruit. As you start to unpack it, from going from a basic cake recipe to things that are more complicated, whether it's citrus or fruit or spirits, anyone can do this. I think that there are two things that still terrify American cooks: fish and baking. And that's why it's so hard to find in many parts of the United States a whole fish. Everything's already filleted, because people are horrified by the idea of, what do I do with a whole fish?
It's so true.
And
It's so
similarly, people are frightened by baking because they have this idea that it's, it's terribly scientific and precise, and I'm going to make a mess of it. And if I make a mistake, it's going to be a disaster. Do you think baking is more forgiving than most people actually believe it to be?
completely. I mean, I
Okay.
think these recipes are so easy. And I actually, one of the reasons I actually love to make cakes is because there is that wow factor. People love when you make them a cake, and they think that you have gone to, and I've dispelled this now, but they think that you've gone to all of this extraordinary length to make it. I think there is this element of fantasy to it. I remember, years ago, my son's best friend came over to the house, and I had cake and I had some whipped cream. And this is super smart kid. And he just said to me, New York sophisticated kid, he said to me, how do you make whipped cream? Like, how do you I mean, what is it? And
This, you said.
I thought, this is so easy, but it does look like magic. And I think this, I think there is that similar thing of, here's flour and sugar and all of these things, and suddenly it emerges as this cake. Oh my gosh, it must be incredibly complicated. But in fact, I really, and what I wanted to do in the first chapter of this book is say, in maternelle, which is, kind of nursery, kindergarten, school, kids in France do learn to make a yogurt cake. And if a 5-year-old can do it, we can all do it, and it is one bowl and one yogurt container and a whisk. And you just, you dump the yogurt in, and then you use that container and you measure the rest of the ingredients with it. And it's foolproof and very simple. And you put it together in 5 minutes, and then you put it in the oven, and then, in a little bit of time, you have this incredible dessert. And then, once you have that recipe, and it becomes kind of a back pocket recipe that everybody knows how to make, and you have it for life, then what I love is that you can riff on it. And so, my friend Delphine, who has 4 kids, will sometimes, take a yogurt cake and she'll cut off a little bit for grownups, and we'll just do a little bit of a brushing with a simple syrup that's spiked with a little bit of Cointreau or Grand Marnier or Calvados or Armagnac, whatever it might be. And the other half will just go to the kids. And it's such an easy, practical approach that I love. So that is also what I really wanted to express. I wanted to demystify cakes, because they are, and also Madeleine, because there's such an extraordinary, there's a chapter of Madeleine, there's such an extraordinary, and I believe actually incredibly justified, because having one hot out of the oven is an extraordinary experience. And there's such a kind of sense of the mystique of it. And it takes 10 minutes to put together. You pop it in the fridge and you bake it when people come over right before dessert, and boom, it's no harder than a Toll House chocolate chip cookie.
And probably much better for you.
Yes, exactly.
Because another thing I noticed too, a lot of the French recipes, there's less salt. You're more sparing in a lot of things. To address this, another lurking fear of French food, which is, oh my God, I don't want to gain all that weight. Well, I don't buy into the idea that, French women are all thin and chic. And I think that there is a certain, let's go beyond the Emily in Paris stereotypes of this great, wonderful city that you and I know and love so much. But I think that there is a restraint in some of these recipes. There's just the right amount of salt or butter or whatever it might be. And butter per se is not going to cause you to let your belt down another notch. If it's part of, these cakes are part of, as you said a minute ago, a part of a healthy, wholesome diet, the decision, which is such a primary axis of life in France, which is I'm going to eat well. Even if I'm in a huge hurry, I have, 100 different things that I know how to make that I can pull together, whether it's soup or an omelet or a gratin or, coquillette with jambon or whatever, in very little, without taking a lot of time, because of the whole thing. When a friend of mine saw the book on the counter and said to me, well, Alec, you're always so busy. How do you find time to bake? And I said, no, hold on, stop right there. That's why the book is on the counter. If you look at these recipes, they're not time consuming. For busy people, and you mentioned this before, it's if they're teaching the gâteau, the yogurt cake recipe to children in kindergarten or nursery school, anybody can do this, I mean, and it's not, you turn on the oven, you whip things together and away you go. And the more confidence you have, the more likely it is you're going to be making these simple desserts. But you might want to, or I'd love to hear you explain the difference between these wonderful cakes, which are homey and loving and infinitely satisfying, and pastry. I think that there's some people who, since you grew up in Paris, how would you, for cake and pastry loving people who have joined us today, how would you make that distinction?
Great question. Nobody's asked me that, and it's truly important. This is something else. And forgive me forgive all the French people who are listening. When I say the French, it is massively full of love. And I don't know everything, but I did live there for a long time. But I do think that the French have this incredible wisdom of leaving pastry making to the professionals. Right. And in the same way that I think there is a true separation of home cooking and restaurant cooking, at least restaurant cooking specifically at a high level. And, and when you go into a great pastry shop in Paris, the chances are that the pastry master behind it has, started to apprentice at the age of 13 somewhere, and, and doing almost, menial work. And then after a couple of years, got to graduate to something a little bit more complex, and maybe went to culinary school, and maybe had a small shop somewhere. And then maybe, it kind of, by the time you're actually going in and buying a beautiful piece of patisserie, that person has trained for, 15, 20, 25 years. And so I think there's, part of this idea of French cuisine as art is true, because that aspect of it really is. And I think that sense of, okay, we're going to leave pastry to the people who have studied it, in the same way that the Japanese leave sushi to the people, maybe excessively, but who have been cutting fish for 7 years before they are allowed to make sushi. There is that nice sense of, okay, I'm not going to try and do that, because it's better done by the people who really do it. So the difference here are really, these are mostly incredibly undecorated cakes, right? I mean, I think that I don't think I've ever been to anybody's house in France where they have actually decorated a cake in the way that in America somebody might do icing and writing and little rosettes and kind of fancy things. It is much more of an idea of, this is going to be a single layer. It's going to be simple. It's going to taste good. Everybody's going to like it. Nobody's going to fuss over it. I'm not going to spend loads of time making it look very fancy, because the simplicity is beautiful. And so it is very much the opposite. And yet there are these things that also go together. For example, there's a chapter on genoise, and everybody in America, I think, is terrified of genoise sponge cakes because they are dry. And they're meant to be dry because they're meant to absorb quantities of soaking syrup, which give it flavor and just the right amount of moistness. And they're incredibly well-structured cake, so they don't turn to mush. If you go into, patisserie, maybe you will have 10 incredibly thin layers of that, each layered filled with a different buttercream and maybe a different soaking syrup, and then beautifully glazed and beautifully decorated. And yet if you just take it down to, okay, this is going to be one layer, and maybe I'm going to cut it into two layers, but it can be one layer, and I'm going to add the soaking syrup, and I'm going to add a little bit of creme chantilly or creme fraiche on the side, and I'm going to toss some berries, with a little bit of creme de cassis, and present it. You have a really simple, fantastic version of what you might have in a patisserie, but without the levels of complication. Is it going to be as jaw-droppingly magical. No, but it is to, I think, and I think this is also very French, is it is beloved. It's, that the French, I think, are less wowed by novelty than we are, meaning that I think in America, we're constantly going with the next trend, right? And, we see that in, Brussels sprouts and avocado toast and kale and all of these things that kind of cycle through. And, when I think for the French, the idea is much more, let me eat something that I know I love, that I've always loved my whole life, that is a beloved taste, and let it be well made with care and good ingredients. And
well, that's why I think really this is almost comfort food baking. There are some very many sophisticated recipes, but I think that's very true what you said. This is, if I didn't have a French grandmother, but I think if I did, or a French mother for that matter, these are the things that she would have baked for me and my two brothers and sister. And those are the things that all through your life, they become totems. I mean, they're emotional totems. They're totems of pleasure that you remember. And yet there are also cakes within this register, things that are more complex. And that's why I loved another chapter in the book that's so wonderful, are the regional cakes, because as you and I know, and I don't want to confuse anyone by saying this, but French cooking per se doesn't exist. French cooking is an amalgam of all the regional kitchens of France, all of which have contributed things to the batterie de cuisine of French cooking, whether it's from Burgundy or Provence or whatever. But for example, when you have the gâteau basque, which was fascinating to me, I'd never made a gâteau basque before. I love gâteau basque. And I came across that recipe and I thought, this is absolutely perfect, because I wanted a dessert that would be special and fun for a house party weekend in September in the south of France, but nothing having to do, because where we are when we spend time down there in and around Uzès, there are beautiful apricots. There's all sorts of great fresh fruit. But I had done more apricot tarts than than was decent.
Yes.
And I tricked them up with rosemary steeped in simple, all kinds of fun little tricks. Anyway, I went to work at a gâteau basque. I'd never made one before. Your recipe delivered massively, and everyone was so impressed. I mean, that the American had baked a gâteau basque. Maybe you want to tell everybody what we're talking about, and also talk a little bit more about the regional baking traditions in France, because from there are parts of the country that bake more than others. There's baking everywhere in France, but some parts of France, like Alsace perhaps, or oddly enough, Brittany, they're very, very eager bakers in those parts of the countries, and a little less elsewhere.
A little less where it's warmer, I think, definitely too. I mean, I love the regionality. I wanted this book in a way I wanted to think of it as a Paris book, so that I didn't have to pick a region or so that I could kind of get away, because I do feel like Paris, like New York, and the beauty of food in Paris is that you're allowed to take from wherever, because everybody is from everywhere. But I do, and when I was living there, we would spend weekends in Normandy, so that was definitely the kind of the food of my childhood in a way. Yes, lots of cream, lots of butter, lots of apples, lots of Calvados, all of that good stuff. I think when people ask about regional food, one of the things that they are surprised about is how is it that I can call for either Armagnac or Calvados or Cognac and not specify. And I think that is it's something that one becomes accustomed to, because you really do. Not only do you cook with what you have nearby, but the things, and this is, many people say this, but the ingredients that grow together go together. And I think that, that is why apples and Calvados obviously go to, one is made from the other, but also kind of prunes and Armagnac, and and you can kind of go down and look at that. The regional chapter was really important to me, in part because again, going back to what we were talking about before, this idea of what it is that you grew up with is so important. So if you do leave a small town, and so many people in France who live in small towns or who live in the country are moving to the cities, and it's actually a kind of a crisis. But what is also happening is that they are bringing those recipes with them wherever they go, and there is that desire for them. And yet you cannot actually find recipes from a different region in a bakery in the region you're going to, right? It's the way that you can't find, an epiphany cake or a bûche de Noël or any of these cakes at any other time but the time in which they are meant to be had. The Gâteau Basque is a wonderful recipe, and it's interesting because there's another version that is in Spain that is so similar, but has a slightly, but is not called a Gâteau Basque, right?
I like yours better.
Thank you. And I love, there's a recipe for a far breton, which is a flan. It's one of the few times I made something that's really not a cake in the book, because I wanted it to just be cakes. But it is this Breton dish that is so silky, and and I think kind of miraculous. When we think of a flan, we kind of imagine generally something that's a little bit heavier, and this is ethereal and light, but it's deeply, deeply flavored. And if you soak some prunes and some Armagnac or some raisins and some rum, and you just get those little pockets of intense flavor, it's absolutely exquisite. And then oh my goodness, there's so many. But I think one of the other things that really interested me is kind of where butter and olive oil become most prominent, which is a little bit like Italy, where the southern recipes have olive oil and the northern regions use butter, and so there's an olive oil cake recipe that I absolutely love in here, that is very, very much the kind of cake that you would get in Nice, right?
Exactly.
And I wanted to emphasize also that that there are areas that went back and forth between the French and Italy for hundreds of years. And so that influence is there. And likewise, I think that there's a lot more North African food and flavors in France, Mediterranean flavors, than there are elsewhere. So I definitely wanted to add a little bit of ras el hanout to one of the possible variations for a cake. And
well, it was fun when you talked about orange flower water and rose water too, because France, something else I think that Americans might be less aware of. France is not static. I mean, it's a country that during the years that I've lived there, it is a more multicultural country than it's ever been before. And the intake of after the North African countries became independent, and there was the huge exodus of French colonial families from Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco, they brought home a knowledge and a cooking style that was completely different from what had existed in France before. And I mean, the history of that and the impact that it's had on French cooking, including baking, has been huge, because, for example, pickled lemons, which I think are starting to become more common in the United States, are one of my favorite cheats, flavored cheats. I use them sometimes in cakes too, sometimes in a savory. And it's, when you go toward the fat, and this is another genius thing that the French do, is the savory cakes, which, whether they're to be served with the apéro or, a drink before dinner, or for picnics, or for, I know that French friends of mine would say, when I was reading your recipe for a croque monsieur cake, a French friend of mine was looking at the book and said, "Oh, that's what my mom always made when we would drive to the coast." She'd bake one of these things. The idea was, again, going back to frugality. You'd have the gâteau. You'd pull off the road. You'd find a shady place, and you'd have fresh fruit and crudité, fresh vegetables, and a little bit of a savory gâteau that was easy to slice. And it made everybody wildly happy before it's time to get in the car and keep driving, on the
Oh, I love it.
calls.
Yes, yes. I mean, I have to say, savory cakes completely saved us during the pandemic because I've never been somebody who made lunch. So if I made one savory cake, I could kind of feed the family lunch for 3 or 4 days. But what they are, for anybody who doesn't know, is they really are. I mean, we would call them, I suppose, a quick bread here, but they are a cake in which everything that you love in a sandwich is put into the batter, so that if you love a grilled cheese and ham sandwich, you actually put the cheese and the ham into the batter, and what you get is this incredibly moist cake that has little pockets of cheese and little pockets of ham. And yes, they're traditionally served with an aperitif, and what I really love about them, however, is that or let me say, I have an aversion to sandwiches which are not served at the right time or the right temperature, which drives me crazy, right? I mean, either you eat a sandwich when it's just made, which is
Right.
great, or it's, a sandwich that's meant to marinate for a little while, whole other thing. But generally, when you eat a sandwich, it's at the, it's been in the fridge, or it's been in a lunchbox, or it's sat on the counter. It's almost never exactly what it should be. And my son, who I think is probably spoiled on the food front by this point, hates sandwiches for that reason, and loves these, because what you have is everything that you want in a sandwich, but it is a nice thick slice of something moist. It does not need to be refrigerated. It can be served at room temperature. You don't need a fork. You can eat it, you can just break pieces with your hand. You can put it in a lunchbox. You can put it in a tote. You can have it after going to the ballet or the theater or the opera or the movies at midnight when you want a snack. You can have it for breakfast. You can do anything with these cakes, and they stay moist for a couple of days. But one of my, I got a little playful with that, and not all of those recipes are classically French. I was making a caprese salad one day, and I realized, well, wait a second, I could just toss all of these ingredients into the batter. And what I quickly learned is you actually do want to cook the tomatoes a little bit so that they release some of their liquid. But a savory caprese is kind of that great last bite of that salad, where you take the edge of bread and you kind of, run it across the plate, and you get a little bit of olive oil and a little bit of basil, a little bit of mozzarella, and a little tomato. And I wanted it to taste like that. And I was so happy it really did. And then
Absolutely does.
Right. And then when I got into doing a little bit more research, going back to the regionality, I realized that, depending on where you are, the cheeses you're going to use are going to be different. But that's wonderfully playful. And that if you want to go and do something that almost serves as a kind of combination of a cheese course and, have it with a salad, and it kind of does everything in one, is to do a savory cake with a little bit of roquefort and walnuts, which is just terrific, or add a little bit of diced pear in there. Fantastic. Also great in a madeleine, by the way, if you dice them into very tiny little pieces. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I think that tequila has become a thing, very good tequila in France. So I wanted to play on that and do something with a little bit of tequila in it, and some smoked peppers and paprika and kind of chorizo, and that was fun. So I kind of went to town on that one.
You mentioned also, and this is something else that I think of, since I work at home, and as do many people, more people now than ever before, there's what I call the lunch problem, which is, oh no, it's suddenly 12:30 and I'm hungry, and eating something tasty is meant to be a break from my work, and sort of the reward for having stuck to the keyboard all morning. These savory cakes are, if you make one on, every 3 days or so, you can play with them, and they're the perfect solution to the lunch problem for people who are remote working. And, you have that with some salad, and you've actually had a really delicious meal, hugely satisfying meal, without falling back into the soup, sandwich, soup, salad, soup, sandwich.
Exactly.
where we all went to. There was another thing I wanted to make talk about though in the book, and I think that a lot of people are now very concerned about gluten and trying to eat gluten-free diets. There are a lot of great recipes in your book that using nut flour and other flours, spelt and other flours that would really be quite interesting to people who are trying to who are either celiac or for whatever reasons are just trying to eat less gluten or no gluten. You propose a lot of really interesting recipes. I mean, the spelt flour, spelt is something I don't think most people actually know what it is. Although I see it more now. I mean, it's I'll let you tell people what it is.
But also, as you said, the almond, there's a lot of nut flours, and in France, I don't think they're not necessarily called these cakes. You won't read them as gluten-free or it's just they don't have flour because they're not meant to have flour.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that instead of using a gluten-free flour mix in a regular cake, which is in fact kind of hard to get perfect, hard to get right, switching entirely to a cake that is actually designed not to have flour, that's not meant to have flour, to me just makes more sense, because it means the recipe is kind of what it is meant to be and tastes good. But one of the things that struck me in doing that, and again in research, is how so much of what we think is very, very contemporary is in fact very, very old. And, in going back to the Middle Ages, a lot of these ingredients were used, including, for example, rose water and orange blossom water, and nut flours, and these kind of what we call now heirloom grains. And here they are, and they're back again. And for some people, they've never left, but they do feel like they are kind of right on target to this moment, which is interesting. But I love, for example, when you brown butter, you get the smell of hazelnuts. And if you mix that brown butter with hazelnut flour, you do get a truly spectacular cake, because you get that hazelnut flour, but you also get that depth of and richness of the butter, and such a simple cake. It's one of my absolute favorites. Takes no time to make. I also love, the French do a lot more with pistachios than we do in the States. And I love cooking with pistachios. And I love, there's a pistachio cake that is almost pudding-like. It's incredibly, incredibly moist. That is delicious. One of my favorite kind of gluten-free recipes, though, are the dacquoise. Again, a regional recipe from the town of Dax. A dacquoise is somebody from the town of Dax, but it's great. They're just these fantastic rounds of meringue, which are incredibly easy to make and obviously have no flour. And you can fill them with a little bit of whipped cream. You can fill them with a buttercream. You can fill them with a quick ganache mousse-like thing, and suddenly you get this really spectacular dessert that definitely has no gluten in it, and is very playful and whimsical. And if you do live near where there are apricots in the summer, you can slice up some apricots and maybe toss them in a little bit of liquor, and just do layers of creme fraiche and apricots and meringue, and it's fantastic. So I when friends of mine who are gluten intolerant come over, I will often try and do something that they're not used to, which is to kind of to bake a cake that doesn't feel like they're substituting one thing for the other. And
well, you can bake lots of wonderful cakes that don't feel like privation for someone.
Yes,
because a lot of the gluten-free recipes that I see in American publications, they're always couched somehow or another, almost like in some medical terms or something. There's no sense of privation about being gluten-free with a lot of the gluten-free recipes, or recipes that can be made gluten-free or dialed down in your book, because the motor of your book is pleasure. So
right, joy. It's meant to be joyous.
Exactly.
A cake has to be joyous. And that's why also my sense is, why not have a cake that has really great flavor to it, so that you don't need excess sugar. as opposed to trying to make a cake with, dates or agave or, something that is actually is going to really change the texture, mostly in a not very good way. So
I'm
once
glad you
start
said
putting
that, because
flavor
my
first.
agave disasters could be, you know,
Yes.
I'm glad that no one has looked in the window and seen some of what's come out of
Yeah.
my oven when I try to use
No.
agave.
Agave is just for tequila. That's it.
Right,
That's
exactly.
my feeling about that.
What are
Yeah.
you planning to make for dessert for the holidays? Are you, if you're entertaining or just doing family meals, are
Yeah.
there recipes in the book that you are looking forward to doing, or?
Absolutely. So I will say I'm not a fan of the classic pâte d'épices. I like, spice cake. I like, it's always a little bit too dry for me. And so there's a recipe in this book for a moist one that I absolutely love. And no, you can't keep it for weeks, but it's fantastic. And so I'm going to be making that next week. And then, I am 100% a bûche de Noël person. And I change flavors. When I did live in Paris, my father and I used to go to to Moulot to pick out our bûche de Noël, and I would
so much.
so much, and I would always go for the mocha, because to me, I don't know how old I was, maybe 10 or 11, but the idea of having coffee still had this kind of grown up mystique to it. And then one day there was this extraordinarily elegant woman in front of us in line, and just beautiful coat, beautiful handbag, beautiful hair, and just a stunning face. And I didn't know who she was, but she ordered a chestnut one. And when it was time for us to order, I surprised my father and said, I want a chestnut one. But as this woman had turned to leave and walked out of the shop, my father said that was Catherine Deneuve. And exactly. And I thought, okay, I had no idea who she was at the time, but I definitely ordered the chestnut and felt completely in love with it. The other one, I'm a huge fan of yuzu, and and I know it's kind of all the rage everywhere now, but I think it's been used for a while, certainly in Japan. And what I love about it, in the way that I love bergamots or pomelos, is that it's a citrus that has extraordinary fragrance to it. You could spray yourself with yuzu and it would be the most beautiful perfume. And so there's a recipe in here for a coconut genoise bûche de Noël with a yuzu buttercream that is really fantastic. And to me has that, after a heavy meal, you do sometimes want, and for us that's very English. In fact, it's roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, but you do kind of want that citrus burst. You want something that is going to wake up a little bit. So that is what I'm going to do. That's definitely.
I'll tell you, if you're interested in knowing, I have the book open right here, and I have been salivating all over the bûche de Noël, pistache, cerise, morello, and ganache.
That's a good one.
That I thought I saw that, and you can get these morello cherries, actually, believe it or not, at Trader Joe's.
You can? Oh,
yep.
Wow, I didn't know that.
There are lots and lots of ingredients that people looking at the book, and that was something that fascinates me, because in our lifetimes, America has been such a good student of France in the kitchen, that the Atlantic Ocean is narrower than it's ever been in terms of gastronomic miles, and the availability of, there are no esoteric ingredients in your book. Most American supermarkets would have absolutely everything in this book. So it's not a question of suddenly thinking, oh dear, well, if it's a French baking book, they'll probably do all sorts of things I can't get. That's certainly not the case. You can find all this stuff here. And this particular, gosh, it sounds so delicious.
So it's a pistachio. Let me just explain. It is Please. A riff on a Black Forest cake. So it is, but I did it with a pistachio sponge cake, chanoise, and you could do it with a chocolate one or an almond one or a plain one, whatever you want. But just because the French do like to take shortcuts, and I like to take shortcuts. I mean, yes, you can marinate cherries in some kirsch and you can get something quite beautiful, or you can just buy them, and if you buy a good one, they'll be fantastic. But really, all you need to do with something like that is, some fantastic whipped cream, some marinated, or macerated, I suppose the word is, cherries on this fantastic pistachio sponge cake, and roll it up in a dark chocolate ganache, and couldn't be easier, and so good. I love pistachios. I told you.
Draw the curtains and eat it all by yourself.
Exactly.
And then make another one for your guests.
And what's playful, I think, too, is what I wanted to convey is, if you want to make a buttercream, if you have the time and the energy and all of that to make a buttercream, go for it. Absolutely. But let's say you are down to the wire, or you don't want to attempt a buttercream, whip up some cream. Very, very easy. Spike it with a little bit of something. And, will it last overnight? No, you'll have to use it pretty quickly, but it's so simple, and it's delicious. So never worry. I want people not to worry about their shortcuts, because I think they're just part of life, and why not?
Well, I think that your book expresses, and this cuts right across most things in French culture from my point of view, these wicks of simplicity and frugality create an enormous daily elegance. And that is sort of transcendent throughout this absolutely wonderful book of yours, Aleksandra. I mean, it's just, it really was just a pleasure to read. I mean, I love reading cookbooks. And I wish I could hold up my spattered, filthy copy of your book. There you go. Thank you. But again, thank you so much for doing the book. And I think, and also thank you also for, putting a candle in the window to again remind Americans that the essence of really eating well in French is simplicity and frugality are really important parts of it. And the French today, especially in Paris, Parisians are as busy as anybody else is in the United States. People don't have a lot of time to do these things. I'd say 80% of the recipes in your book can be done in like half an hour, 40 minutes. So this is not something for, it's not fussy, it's not complicated. This is just a really wonderful daily life cookbook that you've made to us, and thank you for it.
Thank you so much. And my goodness, you speak so beautifully and write so beautifully, and I'm deeply touched.
Thank you, Aleksandra.
Thank you. Do we have questions that we are?
I think we have some questions. Again, thank you both so much. I mean, we could listen to you forever, and I think we're all going to be hungry for these extraordinary recipes. It's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book, and the recipes speak to that. So somebody has said, let's just look, Melissa. We have a comment from Veronique. Whole Foods sells a Gâteau Basque during the holidays. I'm from the Basque region, and I must say their rendition is quite good. The big battle now in my region is what flavor they should have. Plain cream, the original, or Itzazu cherry. I don't know if that's a typo.
Those are cherries that grow in the Basque country.
Okay. But new flavors are being added, like apricot or even chocolate, ! For purists like me, I have my favorite bakery that sells what is the best Gâteau Basque with their original cream. So what Joseph Hinshaw is saying, after hearing about your book, Aleksandra, my girlfriend is now hosting a cooking class for Gâteau Yaourt this Sunday.
Oh, fun.
Somebody from Winnetka says that the Winnetka Public Library has a copy. Trisha thanks thanks you for the conversation. And then I'd had one, many of us at many Alliances Françaises have been celebrating the 100th anniversary of the death of Proust. This book, I think, takes us back. There's so many recipes. I know personally, I've spent many years in France. There's so many recipes. There's so many flavors in this cookbook that just sort of take you back to a place, a memory. And that creating that for people all over the world, I think, is extraordinary because these flavors are simple, but they resonate with so many different regions and so many different people. So I think hopefully people will look at Proust and look at you and the memories that you were creating.
I hope so.
What else, Melissa? Do we see anything else?
I don't see any other questions at the moment.
If people have them, they're welcome to message me on Instagram.
And I just had one more comment. Your savory chapter in the book is, to your point, absolutely extraordinary. That lunch problem, for those of us who have now retired husbands or grown children or little grandchildren, it solves the problem of the wet bread on the counter versus the wonderful crispy toasted bread. I mean,
Yes.
It's delicious, and it's the croque monsieur cake. I think I've already made 4 or 5, and it's a huge success. So we thank you so much for that. And unless anyone has any other questions, Melissa, do you want to just make sure that everybody knows that they can message Aleksandra?
And I have one quick thing to say is that there is an error in the first edition of the book, which is being corrected. For people who know how to bake, it's not an issue, but in the chocolate hazelnut cake, the chocolate is folded in right before the whipped egg whites, and that was omitted. So we're correcting that, and it's corrected in the ebook. But I just wanted, I'm trying to tell everybody. So yes.
Well, thank you. And I'm hoping that, Melissa, let's just make sure that everybody can see where to buy both books. And I hope everybody takes the time to read Alex's book, the My Place at the Table. I just finished it, and it's a wonderful book. And these are all great Christmas presents to everyone. So everybody invest in these wonderful books for house presents. And thank you so much for sharing these amazing recipes. I think we're all going to be enjoying being in the kitchen over the holidays.
Thank you.
So thanks everyone for coming. Merry Christmas, happy holidays.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy holidays to you all. And now I'm going to go start working on the Bouche de Noël pistache.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye-bye.